Okay, well, good morning, everyone, or good day, depending on when you're watching this. This is John Haller with the Israel Update from Fellowship Bible Chapel. I have with me today two very special guests. I have Jonathan Spire, who is with I think you're still with the Middle East Forum.
That is correct.
Also a regular columnist at the Jerusalem Post, and really a very excellent war and military correspondent in the Middle East, probably easily one of the top. And then Simon Barrett, who does a program called Middle East Report on Revelation TV in the UK. So welcome, guys. So I'm going to start with Jonathan. Simon's going to kind of help me with questions. We're recording this pretty early in the morning in Ohio time. So I'm getting old. I'm not as quick in the morning as I used to be. So I asked Simon to come in to help. But Jonathan, you have a lot of experience. You wrote a book about the civil war in Syria. You spent a lot of time up there. You made a lot of observations. So I want if you could just kind of summarize a little bit your knowledge of the Syria situation. Then we'll talk about Gaza and we'll talk about the war in the north and whatever else we have time for. So what was your experience in Syria? And then maybe kind of related to the situation that's going on in Israel right now with Gaza and the threat of war in the north?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question, John, and a really interesting formulation. In terms of my experience in Syria, so I just covered the Syrian war as a correspondent very extensively over I guess, usually counted as 7 years of civil war in Syria between 2012 and 2019. I covered the war from all sides. That's to say, from the rebel side, from the Kurdish side, also from the regime and pro-Iran side, physically speaking, that is. I mean, I traveled the country. It wasn't possible to cross the lines, so to speak, in terms of the reporting of Syria, but you could travel in and out, and one time you'd go to the rebel side, one time you'd go to the regime side, and I was one of the cohort of journalists who were doing that quite intensively over that 7-year period. In terms of relating that to the current situation, that's an interesting thing to do, and I think not enough people really try to do that, because not enough people, I think, look at the regional aspect of what is going on between Israel and Hamas and Israel and Hezbollah. The fact of the matter is that Syria remains divided into three parts, that is. The regime of Bashar Assad is largely a shell, and it controls about 60% of the country. But the vital thing to understand is that in the area it controls, the Assad regime is not really in control. What's in control is either the Russians or, more importantly, from our point of view, perhaps the Iranians. Let's say Syria today is largely hollowed out as a country, and a large part of it constitutes an area of freedom of action, freedom of maneuver, and of fire of Iran and its various militia, proxies, and components created and maintained, of course, by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So in many ways, Syria constitutes a front of the current conflict. As you know, Israel is hitting at Iranian targets and Hezbollah targets inside Syria more or less daily or nightly. It is also the case, much less reported, that Iranian supported elements in Syria are attacking the US-aligned forces, and sometimes also US forces themselves, who of course are deployed in the roughly 30% of Syria east of the Euphrates, which is under the control of the United States and its Kurdish allies, largely Kurdish allies, in the Syrian Democratic Forces. So in other words, Syria, to my mind, as somebody who covered Syria for a long time, actually constitutes one of the less remarked upon fronts in the current conflict, because I certainly, and many others also, don't see the current conflict in any way as restricted to Gaza. Actually, Gaza is today just one front in a much larger regional conflict stretching all the way from the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden in the south up to Syria and Lebanon in the north, and taking in Gaza as it goes. So, Syria is a vital front in that respect. Another second or final point to make in regard of the Syria comparison, a related point, is to say the following. Israel, of course, is subject to an astonishing amount of media and political scrutiny throughout the world. And indeed, Israeli operations in Gaza are regularly now in mainstream discussion and media misrepresented as representing some sort of almost unique targeting of civilians or place of loss of civilian life. You know, as somebody who's covered the Gaza war fairly closely, and I covered Syria and war in Iraq also against ISIS closely, and I've covered the Ukraine war and other conflicts too in the course of recent years. You know, all the metrics, all the figures don't just suggest but confirm that Israeli military action in Gaza is being conducted well within Western norms, and even to the upper end, to the more prudent end of Western norms when compared to other Western forces operating in comparable environments. The Assad armies, by contrast, Assad's armies and their allies in Syria regularly targeted, openly targeted civilians. I personally, in Aleppo in 2012, witnessed the targeting of a civilian hospital, the Dar al-Shifa hospital in eastern Aleppo, by Assad's air force, as say fighter jets deliberately targeting a civilian air force. I personally witnessed it. And yet there was nothing like the concocted moral outrage that's currently taking place with regard to Israeli action in Gaza when compared to the far worse, far more heinous and far more bloody campaigns conducted by Assad and his allies against their own people. So I think that's something very notable also about the current conflict. In lots of ways, it resembles other conflicts conducted by Western forces. It's certainly a much more careful, cautious business than the way that war is conducted by third world armies like those of Assad or his Iranian allies. And yet the amount of opprobrium and fury directed at Israel, and largely, unfortunately, increasingly against Jewish communities and Jewish people also in the West now, is sort of off the charts. And that's a very notable thing to see. And as a correspondent who's been covering conflict in the Middle East and beyond it for my sins, so to speak, more than coming up to about 25 years now, you know, this is a very, very notable aspect of the reality that we're currently seeing.
It's interesting. They had a forum in at Harvard Law School last night. I saw a video of it yesterday. A large New York firm, Skadden Arps, one of the largest law firms in the United States, and they had come out with a statement about anti-Semitism it was a forum about jobs that are going to be available at Skadden Arps because they want to get some, you know, the cream of the crop there at Harvard Law School. And the Palestinian jihadist, pro-Hamas people took over the meeting, and they were railing against Skadden because Israel was slaughtering millions of Palestinians in Gaza, which kind of seems strange because I don't think there are only 2 million anyway to begin with. So it shows the out of balance thing. I want to go back to Syria for just a minute because I think yesterday or today, Putin is meeting with some of the leadership of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. I don't know where he's meeting with them in Russia, but to what extent was Russia, from your observation, involved on the pro-Assad regime side in Syria, and what did they contribute to the overall effort there to try to keep Assad in power?
Yeah, well, they were as involved as it would have been possible, as it would be possible to be, and their contribution was absolutely vital to the survival of the Assad regime in its current truncated form, as we discussed a moment ago. What forms did the support take? I say in a number of areas. First of all, in the area of diplomacy, the Russians, of course, have a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, which means they have veto power on the UNSC. What that meant was that any kind of concerted international action against the Assad regime via international bodies, most importantly, you know, in this case, of course, the vital institution of the UN, was absolutely impossible from the very outbreak of the war. It didn't matter what Assad did, and we know that Assad used, you know, up to and including the use of chemical weapons against his own people to slaughter thousands of his own civilians. There was no chance of any concerted international action because of the Russian veto power on the United Nations Security Council. This was the first, I would say, vital contribution. The second vital contribution was keeping the arms channels to Assad open. The Russians ignored any attempt at sanctioning Assad or preventing sale or contribution of arms to him. Russian ships were setting out, across the Mediterranean from the outset in order to provide those arms landing at the Tartus naval base in Latakia province in western Syria to keep Assad armed and to keep Assad keep Assad soldiers with weapons and ammunition. And then, of course, as the war progressed, the Russian involvement increased, the direct involvement increased, and finally culminated in late September, I think it was September 30th, 2015, when Russian aircraft themselves appeared for the first time deployed over or in Syria's skies. And this, at that point, really, it was all over for the rebellion. In other words, short of the rebellion being supported by an air force as powerful or more powerful than that of the Russians, from September 30th, 2015, there was no way that they could win. Because, of course, you cannot win a war if you don't have an element of air power. They had none. And the Syrian regime suddenly had one of the more powerful air forces in the world suddenly deployed on its behalf. As a result of that, then Putin on that day effectively decided the outcome of the Syrian civil war, unless the United States or some Western power were to intervene on behalf of the rebellion, which of course never happened. So Russia's role diplomatically and as an armorer, and also as a direct participant, was absolutely vital in Bashar Assad's regime prevailing. It's worth remembering or recalling that the Russian alignment with the Ba'athi regimes in Syria, the Ba'ath Party regimes in Syria, goes back all the way to the 1960s and took in a very close relationship between the then Soviet Union and Bashar Assad's father, Hafez Assad, who of course came to power in the very beginning of the 1970s. So it's a long, deep relationship. The Russians were determined to show that they look after their friends. If their friends get into trouble, by all means necessary, so to speak, or deemed necessary. And they showed that, very, very brutally and very, very ruthlessly. They showed that in the context of the Syrian war. And as a result, Bashar Assad remains, as I said at the beginning, in truncated and reduced form, but nevertheless, he remains the key, the official president of Syria.
So how much, and I don't want to do too much about Russia, but for example, the air support, were they involved in the bombing of, we've seen the pictures of these cities in Russia, parts of Damascus, and it seems to be that what the Assad regime tried to do was hollow out the Sunni presence in a lot of these areas. Now that's my observation. I don't know if that's correct, but was that Russian air support that was responsible or helping out with that, just turning these large portions of cities to rubble?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Damascus is a bit of a separate example in the sense that the rebellion never really made it into Damascus. It made it into areas surrounding the city to the south and north, but it never made it into the heartland of Damascus. But if we look at for a moment at Syria's second city, the northern city, which is Aleppo, which was a large part of which was taken by the rebels, let's say conquered by the rebels in 2012, 2013, specifically the eastern part of the city. I personally was present there reporting, as I already mentioned, in the summer of 2012. That's before the Russian air intervention. At that time, Assad's air force, a much less powerful instrument, of course, was doing its best to turn eastern Aleppo into rubble. But later on, in 2015, 2016, once the Russians intervened, then absolutely yes, Aleppo was in many ways the turning point in terms of the physical battle in Syria in late 2015, 2016, when the regime forces retook Aleppo. Many observers would say that was the key turning moment in the war. And yes, Russian air power played an absolutely crucial role in that. And I visited Aleppo again, actually, in April 2017, that time on the regime side as part of a delegation which was supporting the regime. I wasn't, of course, supporting the regime, but I was just pretending to be a supporter of the regime in order to get the access, and I was with the delegation. And we visited eastern Aleppo shortly after it had received the attentions of the Russian Air Force. And, it was a moonscape. If you think of pictures of Berlin in 1945, it looked something like that. Every single house, every single building, every single street destroyed. There was no electricity and water provision had broken down across the eastern part of the city, so it was essentially unlivable. And that was the handiwork of largely of the Russian Air Force.
Okay, Simon, did you have something you wanted to ask? Simon?
I mean, talking about the current
so
situation in Syria. Oh, yeah. I mean, talking about the current situation in Syria. Now we see really that almost a third of Russian forces have been pretty much destroyed in Ukraine. We're seeing that Russian military technology is about 30 years out of date in comparison to Western military technology that's been used very effectively on the battlefront in the Ukraine. How much is this having an impact on Russia's perceived strength in the Middle East, particularly in Syria? Because it's all about backing the strong horse, isn't it? And we know, for example, with Assad's regime as an Alawite regime, they are a tiny ethnic minority, and they have been in power primarily because when the French had the mandates of Syria and Lebanon as well, the provision was we'll put the Alawites in power because they will then need the protection of a bigger force, i.e. French, against the vast majority of the Sunni Arabs in Syria. So therefore, my question to you really is, has the war in the Ukraine dented the perception of Russian strength in the Middle East, particularly as it relates to Syria?
Well, I think that the issue is one of results ultimately. I mean, I agree with you that clearly Russian military technology lags behind that of the West, and in fact, if we look at what the Russians have been doing in Ukraine in recent months, that they've been, as we know, bringing in all kinds of very, very old Soviet stock, up to and including the deployment of T-55, ancient T-55 tanks. But at the end of the day, everything comes down in war to results. I mean, it's not, the technology may be inferior, but the question I think everybody asks is, okay, but are the Russians getting what they want? Everyone knows that United States military technology is by far the most advanced in the world, but lots of people looking at the results of recent international conflicts go, yeah, that's all really great. But when you saw the United States and its allies pulling out of Kabul in Afghanistan in 2021, or the results of America's invasion into Iraq, the question is, but does it get you what you want? And if it doesn't, then that you don't come out of that with a great deal of respect. Regarding Russia, I think that the results are mixed from a Middle Eastern point of view. The Russians got what they wanted in Syria, and whilst it was on a moral level disgusting without any question in terms of the way they behaved, from a political and power level, it was impressive. They decided what they wanted, and they, to a great extent, not completely, but at least on the most basic level, their guy was Assad, and Assad still has his head attached to his shoulders, and he's still in the presidential palace in Damascus. That's quite an impressive achievement. With regard to Ukraine, I mean, you've
been to Ukraine, by the way, haven't you, a couple times?
Many times. Actually. I first went into Ukraine in 2007. It was the first time I reported there, and I reported from the Maidan in 2013. And since the war began, this current war, at least the Russian all-out invasion, I've reported 3 times in Ukraine. The first time was in Kiev in March of 2022, early March, when the Russian army was still looking to surround the city. And the last time so far was in July of 23. With regard to Ukraine, the verdict is still out, I guess, isn't it? I mean, yes, sure, there was a very notable Russian failure in the first months of the war, specifically to take Kiev, of course, and then there was very, very impressive Ukrainian resistance and a very impressive Ukrainian counterattack at the end of that year. Having said that, the much vaunted Ukrainian summer counteroffensive of 2023 was a failure. And as of now, at least, the Russians are generally seen as having the initiative. Avdiivka, of course, just fell. Huge Russian losses, of course, but Avdiivka just fell on the Donbass front just a few weeks ago. And certainly the concern, I think, in Ukraine now is, well, if Ukraine does not continue to receive large amounts of Western assistance and material, then there could be further Russian gains to come. So I don't think that the Russian invasion, of course, the Russian invasion did not achieve all of its goals. It has not yet, however, turned into some kind of debacle. It's not currently an advertisement for Western strength and prowess. The Russians have taken 18% of Ukraine. They're not being pushed out anytime soon. And currently, at least, and I hope it doesn't last, but currently, at least, the initiative would appear to be with the Russians. Now, the thing is, it's very easy once again to say, yeah, but the way they're doing this is just it's just repulsive. They're training their prisons of some of the most repulsive human beings imaginable, murderers, rapists, promising them freedom if they can survive a year, is it a year or 8 months in combat. They lost 16,000 men, taking a strategically worthless area of Divka, which we just discussed. Yeah, that's all very nice. But we're talking about war, right? We're not talking about, I don't know what, a public relations exercise. If those stupid, brutal, and evil methods end up getting you victory, then who's gonna speak against that? Anybody can speak whatever they want, But if that, heaven forbid, ends up bringing the Russians to, then for sure, in the Middle East and everywhere else, what everybody will register is, Russia's a powerful force. And Russia, is right to describe its enemies as weakening, which is why that must not be allowed to happen. But we should not be in any way complacent. The Russians are not a spent force. They're a very powerful force, and they need to be very powerfully opposed, in my view.
Okay, now I want to come back to Syria and the embedding of Iranian proxies in Syria and Lebanon. But let's now shift to Gaza. And people who follow me and Simon, we've been going over this war ever since October 7th. But share a little bit about your experience, because I know you went into Gaza. You've written a number of columns about it for Jerusalem Post and the Australian and elsewhere. Just what was that like? What did you see? And how did it compare to what you saw in Syria and Aleppo?
That's an interesting question. Well, first, let me just say, myself and a colleague first went down to the Gaza border area on October 8th, on the morning of October 8th. And we sort of drove around many of the kibbutzim there. And so it was an interesting time because, of course, as we now know, that may have been a bit of a foolhardy thing to do, because actually it took about 2 weeks till the last of the terrorists on the Israeli side of the border were rounded up. There was chaos and confusion on that day. There were still corpses strewn on the streets here and there, and broken cars and the rest of it. So, that was my first experience. And then I've been into Gaza twice with the army since then, once to the Shajaiya area with the 36th Armored Division, with whom, in parentheses, I was myself a soldier many hundreds of years ago. And the second time was into the Khan Yunis area a few weeks ago with the 5th Infantry Brigade at that time. What did I see and how did it compare? I mean, the level of organization. I mean, the IDF is an army that I know well. It's the army that I served in. I didn't serve in any other army, and I was in it in the reserve capacity for the best part of 17 years. So I know the army well. So no surprises there. But there's a great difference for me working with a Western style army as the IDF is, compared to working with the other armies that I work with, the Ukrainian army, the Syrian Democratic Forces, let alone the Iraqi Shia militias and the Syrian government army, with whom I've also embedded over the years. The IDF is a well organized, well put together Western style military force, and it employs force in the way that Western armies do. And that's a difference. There's a much higher level of organization and organizational capacity in that regard. So this was one point immediately notable. Didn't surprise me, but it's immediately notable. Another point is that the level of destruction in Gaza is enormous and very, very immediately visible. And in this respect, it does compare to battlescapes that I personally have witnessed elsewhere. There really is a very, very complex fight going on in Gaza against a very determined enemy. As we know, the Qassam brigades of Hamas had about 30,000 mustered about 30,000 fighters at the commencement of the Israeli ground incursion, and I think it began on October 21st, a couple of weeks after October 7th. And most of that force has since been degraded and destroyed. There's roughly 4 battalions, we're told, roughly 4 battalions remaining in Rafah, and then another couple of battalions in the camps of Dir al-Balakh and Nusayrat. So the greater part of that force has been destroyed in combat against the IDF. There's been a real fight in there, and the result of that is a great deal of destruction. A great deal of firepower has had to be directed in order to destroy that force. That's very visible when you're in there, and that job is not quite finished. The other thing to note, on a more, I guess, moral or morale-related point of view, which will be very notable, is just the extent of unity and determination on the part of the mobilized reserve, and of course the regular forces as well, of the IDF. I think that we have a writer here called Yossi Klein Halevi, a very perceptive man who I heard speaking in Jerusalem a few weeks ago, and he said that what the Israeli response to October 7th proves is that the Israeli Jews still have what he called an intuition of peoplehood, which I think is a very nice phrase. And I think that you can see that intuition of peoplehood, or knowledge of peoplehood, in its purest form and strongest form in the ranks of the Israel Defense Forces, deployed in the forward positions, regulars, but also reservists. And that's something which I've witnessed closely and have been very profoundly impressed by. The Ukrainians also, in the wake of the Russian invasion in February 24th, 2022, rose up in a similar way, sort of showing the world the strength and depth of their commitment to their nationhood. I think we've witnessed something similar also in Israel since October 7th, and that's something very profoundly important, I think.
Now,
Jonathan,
go ahead, Simon.
Jonathan, at the end of January, I was in Israel on behalf of the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, and I saw the devastation at Kibbutz Nir Oz. Saw the destruction, I think, of 1,300 cars, many of them burnt, many of them shot to bits. And I think one thing you come to terms with when you're there is the sheer magnitude of October the 7th. And I don't think in any way our Western media outlets really gave their viewers or their readers an understanding of the sheer magnitude of what happened on October the 7th. Now, having spoken to a few IDF soldiers and those in Israel's security forces when I was over there, there is a lot of speculation. I wonder if you can confirm this, that as Israel wraps up its military operation in Gaza against Hamas, then there are contingency plans to go into the north to destroy Hezbollah. Can you just elaborate on that? Because we also know that 80,000 residents that have been forced out of the homes in the north of Israel are refusing to go back because they're fearing another October the 7th, not this time in the south, but in the north. Can you just elaborate on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, we should remember that Hezbollah itself entered the war in a limited way as early as October 8th, when it began rocket missile fire on Israeli targets in the northern border area. And yes, as you correctly point out, roughly the figure I remember is 86,000, of which, if I recall correctly, around 50,000 of those are people who were sort of ordered to evacuate by the Israeli authority, and then an additional 30,000 evacuated of their own volition because of concerns in the border communities that Hezbollah incursions could be carried out along similar lines to October 7th. It's worthwhile remembering that the scenario of what took place on October 7th was not entirely unfamiliar or unexpected to Israelis, but most of the discussion prior to October 7th had assumed that if it came, it would come from the north. In other words, that there would be something like October 7th, but in the northern Galilee. The big surprise for many people was not the details of what took place on October 7th, but was the location. Most people didn't think that Hamas would be able to do something like that. Many people thought Hezbollah could, and many people still think that Hezbollah could, which is why those communities have been evacuated. Yeah, it's not a sort of endlessly tenable situation to have 86,000 people out of the northern communities to basically close down the Israel's north to a radius of or to a distance of 5 kilometers from the border, which is what's taken place all along that borderline. That situation then has to be rectified at a certain point, and I think that many people do consider, as you said, that, you know, even if people do come back or were willing to come back, some of them and not all of them, it's not an acceptable situation to have people living in that kind of danger with, you know, a murderous Islamist militia like Lebanese Hezbollah, you know, a few meters away, literally in some places, from civilian homes, which means that something has to be done. And what that something will be, I think, is currently a matter of much consideration and also much speculation. I can give you my own 2 cents, so to speak, which is that I am personally of the opinion that a large-scale preemptive Israeli action against Lebanese Hezbollah should be carried out at the appropriate time, because it is not endlessly feasible to continue living in a situation in which the Islamic Republic of Iran has effectively created 2 semi-regular insurgent Islamist armies on Israel's borders with the intention of carrying out a long war of attrition against Israel, intended to eventually result in Israel's demise. That is not an acceptable situation, and allowing those armies to continue to be deployed there, even under conditions of ceasefire or attrition or mutual deterrence or whatever it is not an acceptable level of risk. Strategically, Israel has to destroy both those forces. I think and hope we are on the way to destroying the Hamas force in Gaza. As I said, 4 battalions remaining in the south, 2 more in the center. Hezbollah is a much bigger nut to crack, of course. One should not in any way underestimate its capacities or the seriousness of this discussion. But yes, I believe it is strategically vital for Israel to carry out such actions as will result in, at the very least, a very serious degrading of Hezbollah's capabilities, plus the pushing of Hezbollah's forces physically north of the Litani River and a considerable distance, therefore, away from Israeli population centers on the northern border. I think many others are somewhere in that space as well. I think discussions are taking place both on the societal level, but more importantly, I think, you know, within the centers of power. And many people are speculating, at least, that when the spring comes, and hopefully when we will have completed the work in Gaza, or at least be, you know, well along the way to completing it, then attention will need to be turned in a very serious way to the northern border and what needs to be done there.
Can I ask you a question from the standpoint of an American, and Simon from the UK, and where you yourself are from? What's the perception in Israel of U.S. or UK support for the cause, and are there any, I guess, do you see any cracks in the relationship? It seems from here that the U.S. is pressuring Israel to really back off in Gaza before the job is finished. But what do you see happening?
Yeah, I think the US question and UK question are quite different. Obviously, the UK is not of immediate strategic importance in anywhere like the level that the US is. With regard to American support, first of all, I think it's complex. I mean, President Joe Biden, I think, is on a sort of emotional level. I think he is pro-Israel. I think he has those sentiments. I don't think he's pretending. He belongs to that generation of US Democrats for whom support for Israel was an important part of their outlook, and that hasn't disappeared. And I think that the initial support that he offered in terms of bringing, the Gerald Ford carrier group to the Mediterranean, to try to deter Hezbollah intervention into the war was appreciated, very much appreciated by Israelis. Having said that, I think it is clear 2 things. One is that the Biden administration is not that far from the Obama administration in its understanding, or I would suggest misunderstanding, of the region. They do not perceive the Iran-led effort to dominate the region as a real issue or a real problem. They do not, therefore, have the notion of building a strategic counter-alliance to that effort. And therefore, what they do is kind of piecemeal. Yes, they were certainly concerned by October 7th. They wanted to offer some support to Israel. They have done so. They've been quite staunch, in maintaining that level of support. But at the same time, they don't place that support within a broader strategic understanding of the Middle East. It is an election year in the United States, of course, a presidential election here. Those considerations are starting to kick in. The progressive element in the US Democratic Party is quite strong and quite vociferous. Biden appears to be concerned at the possibility of electoral implications for him of what's taking place in Gaza. So all those things, I think, are leading, nevertheless, towards a greater and greater US impatience with Israel, unfortunately, with regard to Gaza, and therefore a growing, I guess you could say, kind of head of steam within the administration for calls on Israel to cease and desist, so to speak. Maybe one of the most telling examples of that in the last 24 hours, for example, was the statement by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who said on record yesterday that 25,000 women and children have been killed by Israel in Gaza. That's more than what Hamas is claiming. Now, his department obviously walked that back. He obviously just misspoke. But, it's a very telling mistake that he would have made an error like that. It's not doesn't just come out of nowhere. So, the idea that serious people could possibly sort of take seriously figures of that kind, way beyond anything that even Hamas is claiming, reflects, I think, a growing impatience, a growing willingness to believe the worst of Israel in Gaza among some people in the administration, and therefore a growing impatience, which of course could lead, if it goes the wrong way, if Israel doesn't succeed in making its case effectively, in calls for Israel to finish in Gaza before the job is done. That would be, in my view, disastrous from an Israeli point of view, and I hope very much that doesn't happen. With regard to the UK, it's much less immediately urgent. The government of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has been, like the US administration, vociferously pro-Israel following October 7th. Since then, there have been statements that appear to be partially walking that back, specifically from Foreign Secretary David Cameron. Britain is an important country, but it's not. Its supplies and its support are not absolutely vital for the continuation of Israel's war effort. Those of the United States. That of the United States is. So it's different in these respects. Another thing to note. Yeah, please.
Sorry, Jonathan, what do you make of the what's happening in the UK right now? And this is really the kind of exporting of the hatred that we saw from Hamas on October the 7th. 1,200 Israelis murdered, 6,000 injured, many critical, taking over 250 hostages back to Gaza. And now we're seeing that same hatred here in the streets of London. Our parliamentarians in the House of Commons are now fearful of the Islamists. The police have lost complete control when it comes to these Palestinian hate protests that I can only describe as something like the Third Reich by the Nazis in the 1930s. There is a real fear amongst our elected politicians that they've lost control. And the fact that Islamists are able to actually use a projector to project onto Big Ben on the Palace of Westminster, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. The fact they've taken London Bridge every Saturday, they're having protests that is now actually preventing the Metropolitan Police Force from actually dealing with crime, because they're having to guard and provide policing for these massive protests. And now we're seeing the election of George Galloway in Rochdale, who will be a figurehead for the Islamists. Isn't there a danger now that the West needs to wake up and realize that if we don't support Israel, the Islamists could win, and then mobilize support as they're rallying behind this cause right now in order to carry out a kind of Islamist takeover, certainly of Britain and maybe other European countries?
Well, yeah, that was the other aspect I wanted to talk about with regard to the UK specifically, was that the presence of these marches of sometimes up to hundreds of thousands of people on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. I do think that reflects a very deep problem in the UK, and I think in other countries too, which is that a section of the Muslim population, not everybody, but it's a considerable section, have very, very profoundly anti-Israel views. Many of them have very profoundly anti-Jewish views as well. And many of them, unfortunately, are not particularly patriotic or committed to the way of life or the culture or the history of the country in which they're resident. And I think that's very much come to the fore in recent weeks on those demonstrations. And those people have kind of found their way to a section of the radical left in the UK context specifically, which is also, which shares their disdain for or hatred of the values of and institutions of the the country in which the country of their common residence. And yeah, I do think, and I totally agree with the way you put it, Gaza has, in a sense, served as a kind of sounding board, so to speak, that sort of brought the pitch of that to a much, much higher level than we've ever seen before. I was talking to a friend here in Jerusalem yesterday, for example, and we said that, Israel is often and sometimes fairly depicted. I mean, the Israeli political system is often and sometimes fairly depicted as, quite dysfunctional in all kinds of ways. And nevertheless, we tried to imagine a situation in which a mob gathered outside the Knesset and began, physically threatening members of Knesset. And then the chairman or chairwoman of the Knesset got up and said, oh, we're actually going to alter an element now of parliamentary procedure because we're worried about the physical safety of members of Knesset. And we agreed that scenario is basically unimaginable in Israel. It couldn't happen. And, and that's not in any way saying, Israel and the Israeli Knesset and democracy is an absolute example to everybody. No, not at all. And even our system here, which is often quite dysfunctional, it's utterly unimaginable that could happen. So for that to be happening in London, and, what is referred to often as the mother of parliaments, is something quite astonishing. And I think it shows the extent to which democratic procedure and democratic norms, even in that country, have been really brought into question in recent weeks. And if I was living there, certainly, and and as someone who has family there and was born there, I would say it's a very, very urgent moment, requiring of very, very urgent responses in order to defend the ramparts, defend the basic walls and structures, so to speak, of democratic life in that country. So in this respect, yeah, Gaza is linked, I think, to events also in the UK and Europe, and also in the US, where also there have been, very large-scale demonstrations on the streets against Israel of major cities. It's linked. It's the same people in many ways who want to undermine the strength and cohesion of those countries themselves, United Kingdom, United States, other continental European countries and so on. The same people who want that are the same people who want Hamas victory in Gaza and who want, who support many of Iran's proxies, who support the undermining of Western supporters and supporters of open societies in the Middle East, are the same people who would like to see the cause of democracy and open society defeated in Ukraine. So yes, I do think that these things are all linked, and the link between all of them is that, from the three countries in which the three of us are resident are all open societies with democratic systems. And there is a kind of emergent alliance against those systems and that way of life. And we need to understand the gravity of that moment, I think, and come up with equally serious responses to it.
So let me ask you a question. By the way, this is Jonathan's article in today's Jerusalem Post on the northern front, and so sort of take your experience, because I remember I was up there in the Golan in 2017, and actually went down a road and ended up right along the border fence. And and on the other side of the fence was ISIS at the time. So ISIS doesn't seem to be that much of an entity, but so we know that Iran is embedded in Lebanon, but what's the extent of their proxies in southern Syria along the Golan? Is it similar, or are they trying to build it up, or what's your knowledge of that situation?
Yeah, first of all, with regard to ISIS, yes, the rebellion, the Sunni Arab rebellion, was in control of the border area beyond the Golan, or the Syrian side of the Golan, until the summer of 2018. Assad's armies and the Russians came down there in July 2018 and reconquered it for the regime. ISIS is actually still there in Syria as a kind of inchoate insurgent force. They still have good links to the Bedouin tribes in the Baida, in the desert, which is kind of the central Syrian desert, which means that ISIS fighters can still cross. It's a very difficult desert to cross, of course. It means that ISIS fighters can still go back and forth across that desert area, and they are still active, and they do still sometimes attack either the regime forces or further east, the American-supported Syrian Democratic Forces. So we shouldn't forget about ISIS or about Sunni political Islam. It's still an important force to note. But with regard to the Iranians in Syria, the answer is the following. The Iranians essentially have freedom of movement all the way across southern Syria. In other words, all the way from the Iraqi-Syria border in the east to the border with Israel and the Golan Heights in the west. The Iranians can pretty much move back and forth freely. There's one major obstacle to that, which is the United States maintained base in a place called Tanif. The Americans maintain a kind of fire zone around Tanif, which takes in the road going east to west, which means that they sort of preserve the right to shoot at anything going east to west. So that's a major obstacle, a significant obstacle to the Iranians, which is why the Iranians would very much like that base to be abandoned by the Americans. But other than Tanif, the Iranians essentially have, and their allies, essentially have freedom of movement east to west. It's important to note this, going back to where we were at the beginning regarding President Bashar Assad of Syria. When we say that the Iranians have freedom of movement, it doesn't just mean from American or Israeli attention. Assad himself can't tell them what to do because he's very weak. He's maintained more by them than them being maintained by him. The Iranians and their militias control the border crossing, the Al-Kamal, Al-Qaim border crossing between Syria and Iraq. So they can move east to west and west to east, all the way from the Iraqi-Syrian border to the borders with Israel. Having said that, the Iranians' effort to actually build militias in Syria itself, recruiting Syrians, does exist, but they have not succeeded yet in building anything like anything like as strong as Hezbollah in Lebanon, or indeed as the Iraqi Shia militias. So if you look for who's actually fighting for and operating on behalf of the Iranians in Syria, it is also Syrian militias they've recruited, but more importantly and consequentially, it is Lebanese Hezbollah and Iraqi Shia militias such as Kataib Hezbollah, Nujaba, and others that names you're probably familiar with, that are operating in that Iranian-controlled space on Iran's behalf in Syrian soil. And that's the essential contours of it. And that structure then forms a crucial link in the kind of seamless, contiguous area of control that the Iranians now have, all the way from their border with Iraq in the east, across Iraq, across Syria, across Lebanon, to the Mediterranean Sea, and to the borders with Israel. There's a kind of seamless area of control. Syria is a vital part of that, and that's the way it looks, which is why Israel, in addition to hitting increasingly and extensively targets in Lebanon itself, up to and including this week, of course, Baalbek, which is located 75 kilometers from the Israel-Lebanon border, Israel is also hitting targets in Syria. And very often the people that Israel is killing in Syria are not themselves Syrians. They are, in fact, Lebanese Hezbollah people, Iraqi Shia militiamen, sometimes, by the way, also Iranian officials and officers themselves. And when Israel does that, it's hitting at this contiguous Iranian area of control, which stretches also across Syria, and for which Syria is a hugely important element.
So it has Hezbollah, with regard to their experience in the Syrian civil war, fighting on behalf of Assad, have they gained a lot of military experience that they can transfer over into Lebanon and even into southern Syria in the event that there's a conflict erupts in the north between Israel and the Iranian proxies, Hezbollah included?
They did gain experience. They certainly played a vital role on the ground on Assad's behalf in the Syrian war, and arguably, a crucial, an indispensable role. Not just the Lebanese Hezbollah, but the Iran-supported proxy militias as a whole, which of course include, it's worth noting, goes further afield even than Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. At the present time, too, the Iranians are deploying both Afghan and Pakistani Shia militias on Syrian soil. So it's a wide variety of nationalities that they are deploying and have deployed. Yeah, they gained a lot of experience in the Syrian war. They lost a lot of people as well. Hezbollah, I think, lost something like 2,000 people, if I recall correctly. So a lot of heavy loss of personnel there as well. They gained experience. Yeah, there's a cadre, so to speak, of Hezbollah commanders for whom their formative combat experience was on the Syrian battlefield, a very intense battlefield in its own right. Having said that, I think we do have to be cautious in, and they, I think, will need to be cautious in thinking that they can apply lessons learned, fighting against lightly armed, poorly trained Sunni insurgent Arab militias, lacking artillery and air support of any kind, applying lessons learned, successfully engaging with them to the business of engaging with, a very, very different enemy, namely with very, very different capacities, namely the Israel Defense Forces. So I'm sure they'll be trying to work that out in their own way. They'll certainly need to, because yes, they did a lot of work in Syria, but they were in a very different context and fighting a very different enemy there.
So I want to let Simon jump in here, but before we go, I want you to sort of war game for us, if you can, how you think a conflict erupting in the north might go between Israel and Hezbollah, Iran. And I think for a lot of people, I mean, Russia still maintains a presence within Syria. I don't know how many. I've heard it's like 5,000 Wagner troops, but I don't really know. But what role do you think that Russia might play if that conflict erupts? How would that play out in your view?
Yeah, the Russians have most significantly, the Russians have an air defense system still deployed in Syria, which is why Israeli air power has to take their interests into account. But I think there's no likelihood at all, or there's no likelihood of Russia intervening directly in any conflict, certainly not in Lebanon. And even if it were to spill over into Syria, I think it would be very unlikely that they would intervene. But I think there is a possibility if Israel intervenes with the intention of pushing back Hezbollah forces, let's say north of Litani, for example, and if the big war between Israel and Hezbollah erupts, then it's going to be a very, very major engagement indeed. It's not going to resemble what's taken place in Gaza since October 21st, because Hezbollah has a very major rocket and missile arsenal. So if diplomacy fails, as it may very well do, and no diplomatic solution arises to the current unacceptable situation of northern Israel being closed down by Lebanese Hezbollah, if then military action ensues, we could be looking at very major missile and rocket attacks from Hezbollah, from Lebanon onto Israel. And of course, then very exponentially more significant Israeli action against Lebanon. Lebanon will suffer hugely in the event of war of this kind. And there will be, if this prognosis transpires, so to speak, there will be major ground action by Israeli forces over the border into Lebanon in order to engage Hezbollah and push them back to north of the Litani. And this will be not simple at all. We remember the much more limited experience of 2006 when, Israel ground forces deployed into Lebanon and, came up against a very determined force on the other side. So this will be a far more major engagement than we've seen in Gaza, unfortunately, undoubtedly with considerable losses on the Israeli side too, but hopefully concluding with a situation in which Hezbollah capabilities have been profoundly degraded, and one way or another in which that organization then finds itself pushed north of the Litani River, a long way away from Israeli civilian centers when the guns go silent.
Well, I mean, do you,
Jonathan? How much does
Simon.
this fit into? How much does this fit into the kind of Iranian strategy on October the 7th that the Iranians gave a green light to Hamas's attack, and I think it's also believed that Hezbollah was supposed to launch a joint offensive at the same time, and realizing that the more that the Iranians can put the Israeli troops under pressure, this means that the likelihood of Israelis carrying out a preemptive airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities are going to be less and less. So how much is this the Iranian strategy to tie Israeli troops down in Gaza and in the north to enable the Iranian regime to have nuclear breakout?
In the event that the Iranian regime moves towards nuclear breakout, if Israel knows about it, in my view at least, there will then be Israeli air action against Iranian nuclear facilities. Personally, I don't think that the Iranians are looking to, they're only weeks away from the capacity of building an atomic bomb in any case. But I personally don't think that they want right now to have that final breakthrough. But if they do, and if Israel knows about it, then there will be Israeli military action. It'll be air action. There'll be enough planes to carry that out. So it's not the question of, well, they're bogged down in Gaza and Lebanon. They can't therefore carry out air action of that kind. No, I don't think that's realistic. I also don't think that the Iranians want war between Israel and Hezbollah right now, which is why they restricted Hezbollah's response. They're trying to keep Hezbollah's response below a certain level, because what they don't want is for major Israeli action to destroy Hezbollah. They don't want to sacrifice Hezbollah for Hamas. Hamas is a far less important component for them. And by the way, a far less close ally. I mean, Hezbollah is basically a component of Iran's system. Hamas is not. It's an ally of that system. It's quite a different relationship. So they would much rather, I think, let Hamas be destroyed than risk Hezbollah. But in my personal opinion, precisely for that reason, Israel should be thinking seriously now about using the current situation to deliver a very telling blow against Hezbollah for the following reason, for the following sort of strategic reason. The Iranians have a great advantage over Israel, which is that they have forward deployments on Israel's borders. Israel doesn't have forward deployments on the ground on Iran's borders. That's an enormous asset in Iran's hands. It's taken them 30 years to build up those armies, Hamas and Hezbollah, on Israel's borders, semi-regular armies, and they are a very major instrument of Iranian pressure on Israel, which is why I think the Israeli strategy, which was discredited on October 7th, was, well, let's just let them build whatever they want. We don't really care what they build. We're going to have high-tech fences that keep our people safe from whatever it is they're building on the other side, and then we can just forget about them and pretend that we're living in Monaco or Miami or whatever it was. That idea ceased to exist on October 7th. Most people now understand that was a very poor strategy and a very poor approach. What a new approach, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, needs to be is Israel needs to say, no, these armies that the Iranians have spent 30 years building up to use them as instruments for Israel's slow bleeding to death, so to speak, need to be destroyed. So we need to destroy Hamas, and then we need to act against Hezbollah. And the end, and when it's over, there needs to be a situation in which whatever exists on the other side, it is not an Iran-supported insurgent Islamist army waiting to attack Israel whenever it can. That letting such entities exist involves a level of risk, in my opinion, which Israel would be ill-advised to take. So that, I think, is the broader strategic situation, and that's what Israel needs to be thinking about rectifying in the period ahead. I'm not in any way sure, by the way, that any of the, Israel will be able to, given the political and diplomatic pressures that we were discussing earlier, and so on and so forth. But this is what I, at least as a citizen and as an observer, think needs to happen.
So I have two quick questions, because I know we're at the time limit that we set. If in the event of a war in the north, what do you think would be the impact on sort of it's kind of difficult sitting here to determine whether Saudi Arabia is, still really interested in reaching some kind of a detente or peace or whatever under the Abraham Accords, a type arrangement with Israel. I think they're kind of balancing things while the king is still alive. That's my personal opinion. But what if Israel goes against Iran in the north? Would you expect a change in these Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and Egypt? And then one sort of the wild card question, and I'll let Simon ask anything if he wants as we wrap up here, but we haven't really talked about Turkey. Do you see Turkey being involved in this in any way in the near term?
Well, in terms of the Arab countries of the Gulf, and you mentioned also Egypt and Jordan, no, I don't think that if war comes in the north, I don't think anything profound will change in their stance. They'll continue effectively to hedge their bets. That's to say, I don't believe the Abraham Accords will collapse, and I don't believe that Saudi Arabia will be moving forward in diplomacy with Israel, but I don't believe it'll be moving backwards either. I think the current level of relations, a certain amount of tacit and covert cooperation in the absence of formal diplomatic relations, will continue. That's where we're currently at, and I don't think that the current events in Gaza or potentially in the north will profoundly alter that picture. I would suggest or speculate that behind the scenes, probably in the Emirates, United Arab Emirates, and in Riyadh, they will be hoping for an Israeli military achievement against Hezbollah, because they're certainly much more worried about Iran than they are about Israel. For them, Israel is a potential or emergent ally. Iran is a potential or emergent enemy. And so there isn't a symmetry here, but that doesn't mean to say they're going to get behind us, of course, but it certainly doesn't mean they're going to get behind the enemy. With regard to Turkey, is currently governed by an Islamist government, not a pro-Western government in any way anymore. And I think it's important that we need to acknowledge that. At the same time, Turkey in many ways is an ally of Hamas, but it cannot afford to be a military ally of Hamas because of its formal commitments to NATO and to its vital relationships with the United States and with Europe. So there's a kind of odd ambiguity there in Turkey. On the ideological level, the Turkish government is sympathetic to Hamas, and indeed it emerges from a similar ideological origin to Hamas in the Sunni, the Muslim Brotherhood, of which you are aware. But at the same time, Turkey will need to pursue its own interests, and its own interests tend to be trying to kind of place itself midway between East and West and to pursue its own interest in that regard, and it'll continue to do so. So Turkey will not be a major part. If we're talking about the scenarios of war in Gaza ongoing and war in the north, Turkey will not be a participant on either side.
Okay, Simon, do you have any follow-up that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, just one question. Talking about the rise of Jew hatred. Thank you for your excellent analysis and perception of what's going on. Absolutely invaluable, Jonathan. So thank you so much. But is there a great danger that if Israel does then move on to the second front, which is Hezbollah, and already we're seeing levels of Jew hatred at record levels, particularly here in the UK. I think it's gone up by like 167% compared to last year. And every day there's a news story involving Jew hatred of some kind or another, whether it's defacing Jewish monuments or whether it's attacks on Jewish people or schools, or whether it's pop stars essentially chanting from the river to the sea. It's definitely gone mainstream. So the more that Israel carries out military operations in the Middle East, surely the situation of Jew hatred is only going to rise. So is the future now for the British Jewry, for European Jewry, to make aliyah to Israel as we're seeing unprecedented levels of Jew hatred?
Certainly I'm happy that the option for aliyah exists, and obviously I'm a citizen of Israel and very happy when Jewish people come to live here. At the same time, I think that as to whether aliyah becomes an imperative from Western countries will depend very much on how Western countries see themselves. If you take the UK as an example, if the UK wishes to sort of permit the emergence of an Islamist mob on the streets that can basically dictate policy by threatening elected representatives, then that country, with great respect to it, is probably doomed, regardless of whether its Jews stay or go. It's not mainly a Jewish problem. I hope very much that Western European countries, including the UK, don't want to sort of cede their sovereignty and their basic rights to inflamed Islamist mobs on the streets of their capitals. If they don't want that, and I hope they won't and don't want it, then I would say that the defense of their Jewish communities needs to be wrapped into a much larger project, namely the recovery of their own sovereignty from the desire of an Islamist mob aligned with the radical far left in those countries to take away that sovereignty. When I mean national sovereignty, I mean the basic sovereignty of citizens, the basic rights of citizens to elect representatives and have those representatives enact their will in bodies in legislative and executive bodies according to what they were voted to do. If there's some intervening force, which is an Islamist mob, that's a grave threat to the social fabric of those countries. And I would hope that citizens of those countries, non-Jewish in their majority, and I would hope also Jewish citizens too, would unite to try to resist that. I don't know if that will happen. As I say, I haven't lived in the United Kingdom for 34 years. I left it as a very young man. So someone else will know better than I to take the temperature of the society in that country. But certainly if that country wishes to carry on being a democracy, it will need to defend itself against those forces. Those forces do not only threaten the Jews of those countries, they threaten the fabric of those countries themselves. And the sooner that people there realize that, I would say, the better for the possible outcome.
Excellent response. Well, Jonathan, thank you a lot. And by the way, I interviewed Jonathan Feldstein up in Ann Arbor. He lives in a Efrat, Genesis 12.3 project or foundation. And I jokingly said, do you want to go over to Dearborn, which we refer to now as Dearbornistan, because of the heavy, really Muslim Brotherhood influence in that town. And he said, no, I don't go places where it's not safe for me. And I would agree with that. I don't think it would be safe for me there either once they found out my stance on Israel and Christianity and everything. So, Jonathan, I want to thank you so much for doing this. Look forward to doing this more in the future. And we'll wrap it up now. So thanks again. And follow Jonathan Middle East Forum, Simon Middle East Report on Revelation TV. I'll put links in the show notes below this. And hopefully we can do this in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, John. Thanks.